Retro Rewind, the Atari Jaguar. Welcome back to Retro Rewind, the show where we peel back the cartridges, the circuits, and the myths to rediscover the machines that shaped how we play. Today's story isn't just about a console. It's about ambition colliding with desperation. It's about a company that once stood at the very top of the gaming world, only to tumble into obscurity, clawing desperately for one last chance at glory. Our subject today? A sleek black box that promised 64 bits of raw power, a console that was marketed as the future, but instead became a cautionary tale. It was Atari's final stand in the console wars. The name alone evokes curiosity, confusion, and sometimes laughter. This is the story of the Atari Jaguar, the ideas, the engineering, the hype, the heartbreak, and the strange afterlife that no one saw coming. Chapter 1: The Ghost of a Once Great Empire. To understand the Jaguar, we need to rewind to the early 1990s. Picture the battlefield. Nintendo and Sega locked in a cultural war for dominance. Mario versus Sonic. Super Nintendo versus Genesis. Their rivalry was everywhere. TV commercials, schoolyard arguments, and magazine covers. To most players, this was the whole war. But lurking in the shadows was a ghost, a company that had once defined video games themselves. That company was Atari. In the late 1970s and early 80s, Atari wasn't just a brand. It was the brand. Pong, Atari 2600, Asteroids. For millions of kids, playing Atari meant playing video games. The name was synonymous with the hobby itself. But that dominance came crashing down in 1983. The video game crash was catastrophic. Flooded with poor quality games, oversaturation, and waning consumer trust, the North American market collapsed. Revenue shrank by nearly 97%. Millions of cartridges went unsold. Famously, Atari dumped truckloads of unsold ET cartridges into a New Mexico landfill, a story so wild it became urban legend until confirmed decades later. Atari hemorrhaged money. By 1984, the once great company was split apart. The console and computer divisions were sold off to Jack Tramiel, the famously ruthless founder of Commodore. Tramiel had a mantra: business is war. He was a cost cutter, a survivor, and he didn't buy Atari to preserve nostalgia. He wanted to fight in the computer market. So Atari shifted focus. The Atari ST line of computers became its flagship. The console business? An afterthought. Tramiel's Atari released the 7800 in 1986, a console that was technically fine, but already outdated compared to Nintendo's NES. Then came the Atari Lynx, a handheld with a gorgeous color screen that was obliterated by the cheaper, simpler Game Boy. By the early 1990s, Atari was limping, living off lawsuit settlements and investments rather than blockbusters. But Atari's leaders knew something. They couldn't survive forever as a shadow of their former selves. If they wanted to matter again, they needed to return to the console battlefield. The Jaguar wasn't born out of strength. It was born out of desperation, a final gamble by a company that once ruled the world. Chapter 2: An Idea in the UK, Flair, Panther, and the Promise. The Jaguar's true origin story doesn't start in California. It starts across the Atlantic, in Britain. Enter Flair Technology, a small engineering outfit made up of brilliant hardware veterans. These were people who had worked on bold, ambitious machines that never quite made it to mainstream production. They dreamed of bringing arcade-level graphics into the living room, a dream most console makers thought was still years away. Atari noticed them. Desperate for a technological leapfrog, Atari partnered with Flair in the late 1980s. Out of this partnership came two parallel projects. The Panther, a 32-bit console meant as a stopgap, cheap and fast to market. The Jaguar, a far more ambitious, multi-processor beast that aimed to truly leap ahead of Sega and Nintendo. The Panther was Atari's safe play, but as whispers grew about upcoming next-gen machines, rumors of Sony, Nintendo, and Sega gearing up for something much more powerful, Atari panicked. Why waste time on a console that would be obsolete on arrival? So, in 1991, the decision was made. Cancel the Panther. All chips on the table for the Jaguar. This was a bold and reckless move. Atari wasn't just betting on new hardware, it was betting the entire company's survival on an unproven, untested design. For Atari, this wasn't just a new product. It was a lifeboat. Developers who later got their hands on Jaguar prototypes described it like this. It felt like tinkering with an arcade board jammed into a plastic shell. The British engineers bragged that the machine could leapfrog 16-bit consoles. On paper, they weren't wrong. Internally, it looked futuristic. Externally, Atari's marketing found a message so simple it became infamous. Do the math. Sega was 16-bit. Nintendo was 16-bit. Atari, a whopping 64 bits. The number was catchy, easy to put on magazine covers, and hard for consumers to ignore. But was it real? Or was it clever marketing spin? To answer that, we need to look inside the black box. Chapter 3. The Art of Misdirection. A technical deep dive. The Jaguar's architecture is one of the most fascinating and frustrating in gaming history. At its core was the Motorola 68000 processor. This was the same trusty chip used in the Sega Genesis, Amiga computers, and many arcade boards. But in the Jaguar, it wasn't the star. Atari downplayed it as a traffic cop, a general manager for system tasks. The real stars were two custom-designed 32-bit RISC chips, codenamed Tom and Jerry. Both ran at 26.59 MHz, blistering compared to the 68000's 13.295 MHz. Tom handled graphics, a GPU, blitter, and an object processor that could fling sprites and polygons onto the screen. Its registers were 64 bits wide, and it communicated with RAM over a 64-bit bus. On paper, this was bleeding-edge power. Jerry handled audio and signal processing, a DSP capable of CD-quality sound, 16-bit stereo, and additional math crunching if developers needed it. This is where Atari's marketing got clever. 64 bits wasn't entirely false. The bus was 64 bits, Tom's registers were 64 bits, and Atari could claim, with a straight face, that the Jaguar was a 64-bit console, while Sega and Nintendo were only 16-bit. Never mind that the CPUs doing most of the heavy lifting were 32-bit, and that the 68000 was still a 16/32-bit chip from the mid-1980s. Numbers sold boxes, not nuance. Here's the problem. This architecture was a Frankenstein's monster. Multiple processors, each powerful, but each requiring developers to orchestrate complex harmony between them. Programming tools were rushed, documentation was spotty, and many developers simply didn't have the time or money to figure it out. So it happened. Instead of tapping Tom and Jerry's full potential, many developers stuck with the familiar 6800, which meant their Jaguar games ended up looking and playing only a little better than Genesis or Super Nintendo. Players who did the math expected a massive leap. Instead, they felt conned. Think of the Jaguar like a race car with 3 different engines. If you knew how to sync them all, you could break records. But if you didn't, you'd just floor one engine and wonder why the car was sputtering. On paper, the Jaguar could push 2 megabytes of RAM, compared to the Super Nintendo's 128 kilobytes. A color palette of 16.8 million colors, versus Genesis's 512. A true CD-quality audio, and a 64-bit data bus wider than anything Sega or Nintendo had. But power on paper doesn't equal great games, and that paradox, overwhelming potential but impossible execution, became the Jaguar's curse.
Chapter 4. The Controller. Keypads, Overlays, and Ergonomics. Every console has an identity, not just in its hardware, but in the controller that players hold in their hands. For the Jaguar, that controller became part of its mythology. At first glance, the Jaguar controller looked bulky, almost intimidating. Imagine a standard D-pad on the left, 3 face buttons, A, B, and C on the right, and then beneath them, a numeric keypad, 12 buttons, like a telephone. Atari even sold thin plastic overlays that snapped onto the keypad, showing custom functions for each game. The concept wasn't entirely new. The Intellivision and ColecoVision had experimented with similar layouts in the early 80s. But in 1993, when players were used to the sleek 6-button Genesis pad or the comfortable curves of the SNES controller, the Jaguar pad felt like a throwback. Some developers saw the potential. Strategy and puzzle games could map commands directly to the keypad. Flight sims could use overlays for cockpit controls. In theory, the Jaguar controller was a flexible input canvas. But in practice, for fast-paced action games, the keypad was clumsy. Your thumbs were already busy with the D-pad and face buttons. Reaching down for a numeric key mid-battle was awkward at best, impossible at worst. And the controller itself, large, rectangular, and stiff, drew criticism from magazines and players alike. It's as if Atari wanted to design the Swiss Army knife of controllers, but forgot that sometimes you just need a sharp blade, not a clunky toolbox. Ironically, later in the Jaguar's short life, Atari released a Pro controller with 6 face buttons, much closer to Sega's pad. By then, though, the damage was done. The original controller had already cemented the impression that Atari was out of touch with modern design. Chapter 5. The Launch. Price, pack-in, and market rollout. The Jaguar officially launched on November 23, 1993. Atari chose a cautious rollout, first in test markets like New York and San Francisco, then nationwide in 1994. The price? $249.99. The bundle, 1 controller, cables, and a pack-in game, Cybermorph. This was Atari's big moment. Ads blasted across gaming magazines and late-night TV shouting, "Jaguar, do the math." The pitch was clear. Sega and Nintendo were 16-bit. The Jaguar was 64-bit. Numbers don't lie, right? But there was a problem. Marketing budgets were tiny compared to Sega and Nintendo's war chests. While Sega had edgy TV ads and Nintendo had global campaigns, Atari's commercials often aired in odd late-night slots or appeared in niche magazines. Many gamers didn't even know the Jaguar existed. And those who did, their first impressions came from Cybermorph, the pack-in title Atari chose to showcase the Jaguar's 3D potential. Cybermorph was a forward-scrolling shooter where you piloted a morphing spacecraft across polygonal landscapes. On paper, it demonstrated the Jag's ability to handle flat-shaded 3D worlds. But in reality, it looked sparse and felt repetitive. Gamers raised eyebrows at its infamous voice sample. "Where did you learn to fly?" A taunt triggered when you crashed. Instead of feeling futuristic, it became a punchline. The launch lineup beyond Cybermorph was thin. Titles like Trevor McFur in the Crescent Galaxy, a generic side-scrolling shooter with flashy visuals but shallow gameplay, failed to impress. Compared to the SNES's Super Metroid or the Genesis's Sonic 3, Jaguar's launch games felt like half-steps. Retailers noticed. Consumers noticed. The Jaguar wasn't entering the market with a roar. It was limping in with a whimper. Chapter 6, Early Software, Cybermorph, Trevor McFur, and the 16-bit trap. A console lives or dies by its games. And in the Jaguar's early months, the software library revealed the cracks in Atari's grand plan. Cybermorph, as we've discussed, showed polygons but lacked depth. Trevor McFur in the Crescent Galaxy had colorful art but shallow gameplay. Titles like Radon, a port of the arcade shooter, played well but looked no better than 16-bit versions already available. This became a pattern. Developers struggling with Jaguar's complex architecture defaulted to programming for the familiar 68,000 chip. That meant games looked like enhanced Genesis titles, not a leap into the future. Imagine being a kid in 1994. You've saved up for a $250 64-bit console. You bring home Cybermorph, Trevor McFur, or Radon, you boot them up, and they don't look much better than the games your friends are playing on their Genesis or SNES. The disappointment was real. Magazines were conflicted. Some praised the potential power of the hardware, calling Jaguar a sleeping giant. Others bluntly criticized the library, warning readers that the games didn't match the hype. And this was just the beginning. The true heartbreak was yet to come, when brilliant flashes of software would prove what the Jaguar could do, but the majority of its library would trap it in a cycle of mediocrity. Chapter 7. Breakthroughs and Masterstrokes. Tempest 2000 and Alien vs. Predator. For all its struggles, the Jaguar wasn't without brilliance. A few games proved what the hardware could do when handled by the right minds. These titles became legendary, not just among Jaguar owners, but in the broader history of gaming. Tempest 2000, the masterpiece of Jeff Minter. Minter, the eccentric founder in Llamasoft, had built a reputation as a designer of psychedelic, animal-filled shooters. When Atari gave him the keys to the Jaguar, he chose to reimagine one of Atari's arcade classics, Tempest. The result was hypnotic. Bright vector-style visuals exploded with neon color. Power-ups surged with dazzling effects. Pulsating techno beats pushed players into a trance. Tempest 2000 wasn't just a remake. It was a reinvention, a celebration of arcade energy that felt modern and timeless. Players who bought Jaguar just for Tempest 2000 often said it justified the purchase. It was fast, fluid, and undeniably addictive. Proof that, in the right hands, the Jaguar could deliver a game that played and sounded like the future. Then there was Alien vs. Predator, the Jaguar's killer app. Developed by Rebellion, a small UK studio, AVP was a first-person shooter that allowed players to choose 3 campaigns: Marine, Alien, or Predator. Each had unique mechanics and objectives. The Marine crept through dark corridors, desperately scavenging ammo. The Alien prowled vents with speed and ferocity. The Predator hunted with advanced weaponry and cloaking devices. Released in 1994, AVP was groundbreaking. It wasn't just another shooter, it was immersive, atmospheric, and terrifying. While PC players were just discovering Doom, Jaguar owners had a console-exclusive FPS that felt alive, moody, and cinematic. Alien vs. Predator made the Jaguar feel worth it. For a moment, Atari had the game that turned heads, the game that made PlayStation and Saturn fans jealous, if only for a brief flash. Together, Tempest 2000 and AVP formed the jewel core of the Jaguar's library. They proved that Atari's lofty promises weren't pure smoke, but these gems were surrounded by rough stone, and that imbalance would define the Jaguar's reputation. Chapter 8. The Developer Experience. Tools, kits, and the pain of parallel processors. Ask anyone who tried to make games for the Jaguar what the hardest part was, and you'll hear the same thing. The tools were awful. The Jaguar's multi-processor architecture demanded precise coordination. Developers had to split tasks between Tom, Jerry, and the 68,000, balancing timing, memory, and synchronization. To unleash the Jaguar's real power, teams had to dive into low-level assembly, hand-tuning code for each processor. That might have been manageable with great tools and documentation, but Atari didn't provide them. The dev kits were buggy, the documentation thin, and support staff often overwhelmed. One developer recalled, "We spent more time fighting the hardware than designing the game." So most studios took the pragmatic route. Programmed mainly for the 68,000, it was slower, yes, but familiar. That meant games ignored the cutting-edge Tom and Jerry processors. The result? Games that looked like enhanced Genesis titles instead of next-gen showpieces. There were exceptions. Jeff Minter bent the hardware to his will. Rebellion squeezed everything they could out of the memory and graphics. But these were rare cases. Most developers couldn't or wouldn't invest the time. Think about it like this. If you hand a painter with 3 handles, you can't be surprised when most of them give up and just grab the old brush they already know. The lack of good tools and support became a vicious cycle. Developers delivered mediocre games. Consumers lost interest. Retailers cut orders, and Atari, strapped for cash, couldn't afford to improve the ecosystem. Chapter 9. Third-party relations. Hopes, deals, and cancellations. Atari knew from the start that the Jaguar couldn't succeed on first-party titles alone. They needed third-party publishers. Early press releases trumpeted partnerships with names like Ocean, Gremlin, and Microprose. Rumors swirled of Electronic Arts and other big players bringing their franchises to the Jaguar. But behind the scenes, things weren't so rosy. Many publishers were wary of Atari's financial stability. They'd been burned before by the 7800, the Lynx, and Atari's shaky relationships. Why sink resources into a risky platform when Sega and Nintendo were proven winners? Some deals collapsed quietly. Electronic Arts, despite initial talk.
Chapter 10. The CD add-on, price cuts, and the long tail. By 1995, Atari knew the Jaguar was in trouble. Sales were sluggish, reviews were lukewarm, retailers were cautious. To breathe life into the system, Atari turned to the hot new trend of the mid-90s, CD-ROMs. Enter the Jaguar CD. It was an ungainly attachment that sat on top of the Jaguar like a bulky helmet. Players and critics quickly nicknamed it the toilet bowl, because when you opened the disc lid, the resemblance was uncanny. Retail price? $149.95, nearly as much as the Jaguar itself. The promise was clear. CDs offered vast storage, CD-quality audio, and cinematic full-motion video. Sega had the Sega CD. Sony's PlayStation was built on CD from the ground up. If Atari wanted to compete, they had to follow. But there was a problem, one Atari never solved. The Jaguar CD had only 11 officially released games, and most of those were FMV-heavy interactive movies, titles like VidGrid and Blue Lightning that felt dated and shallow. Load times were long, the video quality was grainy, and the gameplay often amounted to pressing buttons in time with pre-recorded footage. There were exceptions. Battlemorph, a sequel to Cybermorph, showed flashes of real ambition. But by 1995, the PlayStation had launched with Ridge Racer and Tekken. Compared to that, the Jaguar CD felt like a relic. Atari tried to sweeten the deal. The CD add-on shipped with a free disc of Tempest 2000's soundtrack, a brilliant move for fans of Jeff Mentor's masterpiece, but hardly enough to sway mainstream buyers. Meanwhile, Atari slashed the Jaguar's price to $149.99 in a desperate bid to gain traction. But price cuts couldn't solve the deeper problem. Without killer software, consumers weren't biting. Atari thought a plastic hat full of CDs could save the Jaguar. Instead, it became a punchline, one more confusing add-on in an era already full of them. Chapter 11. The Fall. Financials, corporate moves, and the end of the line. By 1995-1996, the writing was on the wall. The Jaguar wasn't selling. Atari's revenues were collapsing. The PlayStation and Saturn had entered the battlefield with far stronger support, bigger libraries, and global marketing campaigns. Atari simply couldn't keep up. The numbers were brutal. Analysts estimate Jaguar sold no more than 250,000 units worldwide. Compare that to the Genesis, which sold over 30 million, or the SNES at nearly 50 million. Jaguar wasn't even in the fight. Retailers began pulling support. Developers walked away. Consumers shifted to the PlayStation, dazzled by 3D graphics and franchises like Tekken, Wipeout, and Resident Evil. Inside Atari, layoffs mounted. Entire divisions shuttered. By 1996, Atari was no longer truly a gaming company. Instead, it limped into a merger with JTS, a hard drive manufacturer. The once proud Atari brand, the company that had birthed the modern gaming industry, was reduced to a hollow shell. And the Jaguar? Its life ended not with a bang, but with liquidation. Unsold inventory piled up. Prototypes were canceled. The dream of reclaiming Atari's throne was gone. It's hard to overstate just how far Atari had fallen. From inventing the home console market
to selling off their last console like unsold furniture at a yard sale. The Jaguar had been Atari's last chance at hardware relevance, and it failed. Chapter 12, Afterlife, Rights, Homebrew, and a Community Takes Over. But here's the twist. The Jaguar may have failed commercially, but its story didn't end in 1996. In fact, its strangest chapter came after its death. In 1999, Hasbro Interactive, which had acquired the Atari brand, did something unexpected. They declared the Jaguar an open platform. They released the patents and rights, essentially saying, do what you want with it. This single move lit a fire. Hobbyists and retro enthusiasts suddenly had legal freedom to develop for the Jaguar. No licensing fees, no restrictions. And they did. Homebrew developers picked up where Atari had left off. Communities like Atari Age kept the console alive with new cartridges, CD titles, and even completed versions of games Atari had canceled. The irony is beautiful. Once freed from corporate mismanagement, the Jaguar finally bloomed. Developers created games that showcased what Tom and Jerry could really do. Fans discovered that the impossible hardware could, in fact, shine, if given enough care. Today, the Jaguar has a cult following. Collectors chase rare cartridges like Atari Carts or Rayman. Homebrew developers continued to release new titles, sometimes decades after the console's death. And at retro conventions, Jaguar fans hold tournaments, demo unreleased prototypes, and celebrate the weird little console that refused to die. And then there's the strangest twist of all. When Atari liquidated its assets, the Jaguar molds, the actual plastic shell tooling, were sold to a dental equipment company called Imagine Systems. They used the Jaguar casing to house a dental camera called the Hot Rod. That's right, the same case that once promised the future of gaming ended up sitting in dentists' offices across America. The Jaguar was supposed to roar into the next generation. Instead, it ended up staring into people's mouths. Somehow, that feels like the perfect ending to Atari's strangest console. Chapter 13, Deep Game Profiles, or Extended Analyses. Let's step back from the big picture history and dive into the games themselves. Because while the Jaguar's library was small, scattered, and uneven, certain titles deserve closer inspection. These games reveal not only what the Jaguar could do, but also what it failed to deliver. Tempest 2000, Jeff Minter's psychedelic triumph. Imagine neon lines twisting through three-dimensional tunnels, enemies darting at you in waves, your shots exploding in kaleidoscopic bursts of color. Layer on a relentless techno soundtrack that builds and mutates as you survive longer. That's Tempest 2000. Jeff Minter took Atari's early 80s vector shooter and reinvented it as an audiovisual trip. The Jaguar's hardware, with its fast blitter and sample playback, allowed him to push smooth animation and crisp audio. Unlike so many Jaguar games that felt half-baked, Tempest 2000 was polished, fluid, and addictive. Minter even added new modes, like Beastly Mode and Tempest Plus, giving players multiple ways to experience the madness. For many, it wasn't just the best Jaguar game, it was one of the best games of the 90s. If you owned a Jaguar and didn't have Tempest 2000, you were missing its soul. Alien vs. Predator, a case study in atmosphere. When players first booted Alien vs. Predator on the Jaguar, many were shocked. Here was a console-exclusive first-person shooter that didn't just look good for its time, it felt terrifying. The genius of AVP wasn't just its graphics, it was the 3 campaigns. Playing as the Marine was survival horror, limited ammo, long corridors, constant fear of what was around the next corner. Playing as the Alien turned the game into a power fantasy of speed and ferocity. And as the Predator, you stalked with high-tech weaponry and stealth. Rebellion, the developer, used clever tricks to maximize the Jaguar's limited memory, creating moody textures and convincing darkness. The pacing, slow, deliberate, immersive, made AVP stand out from the twitchy shooters of the era. For Jaguar owners, this was the game that finally justified the 64-bit hype. It sold consoles, earned magazine covers, and remains the system's killer app. Doom, an early FPS on the Jaguar, another feather in the Jaguar's cap. It had one of the best console ports of Doom. id Software themselves were impressed enough with the Jaguar hardware to help optimize the port. While not perfect, it lacked the PC version's music in some levels. It was smoother and faster than the SNES port, and more faithful than most console versions of the time. For many players, Doom on Jaguar was their first taste of id's groundbreaking shooter, and in an alternate timeline, if Atari had secured more exclusives like this, the Jaguar might have carved out a niche as the first-person shooter console. Rayman, an early FPS on the Jaguar. Ubisoft's Rayman also made its debut on the Jaguar in 1995. While most of the system's library looked drab or rushed, Rayman was vibrant, colorful, and smooth. Its lush hand-drawn graphics proved the Jaguar could handle beautiful 2D just as well as polygons. Ironically, Rayman would go on to flourish on PlayStation, Saturn, and beyond. But for a brief moment, Jaguar owners could proudly say, "We had it first." The forgettable majority. For every Tempest 2000 or Rayman, there were half a dozen mediocrities. Trevor McFur and the Crescent Galaxy, shiny, shallow, forgettable. Club Drive, an awkward polygonal racer that felt like a tech demo. Checkered Flag, a racing game so sluggish it became a running joke. Kasumi Ninja, a Mortal Kombat clone remembered mostly for its laughably bad digitized fighters. The library as a whole betrayed the Jaguar's fate. A few shining stars lost in a sea of mediocrity.
Chapter 14, Voices from the Field, Developer Perspectives. To really understand the Jaguar, you have to hear from the people who built its games. Developers' memories of the system are filled with equal parts excitement and frustration. One programmer recalled, "It was like they gave us a Ferrari with 3 different engines. Sure, it could go fast, but good luck figuring out how to drive it." Another, who worked on a canceled Jaguar project, remembered Atari's lack of support. "We'd call for help, and half the time nobody had answers. It felt like we were beta testing the hardware ourselves." Jeff Minter, never shy about speaking his mind, admitted the Jaguar was a challenge, but also a playground. He leaned into its quirks, which is why Tempest 2000 worked where so many other games stumbled. Rebellion, the studio behind AVP, later said the Jaguar forced them to get creative. Limited RAM meant they had to think like magicians, using smoke and mirrors to make the game feel bigger and scarier than it actually was. Those lessons would carry into their future, including later Alien vs. Predator games on PC. For many developers, the Jaguar was both a nightmare and a proving ground. It didn't make them rich, but it made them inventive. The Jaguar didn't just frustrate its developers, it shaped them. For better or for worse, they carried those scars and skills into the next era of gaming. Chapter 15, The Jaguar Today, Collecting, Emulation, and the Modern Scene. Today, the Atari Jaguar has a strange kind of second life. It's not just a relic, it's a community. Collectors prize the console for its verity. Certain cartridges, like Rayman or Atari carts, can fetch hundreds of dollars in good condition. Sealed Jaguar CDs? Even more. The hardware itself, with its odd design and infamous controller, has become a conversation piece on display shelves. But it's not just about collecting. Thanks to Hasbro's Open Platform Declaration in 1999, the Jaguar has one of the most active homebrew scenes of any failed console. Groups like Songbird Productions and communities on Atari Age have kept the machine alive with new releases, reproduction cartridges, and even ports of games that never saw the light of day. Fans have finished incomplete prototypes, optimized emulators, and even released new 3D engines. At retro conventions, Jaguar fans set up booths where attendees can play Tempest 2000, try unreleased titles, or marvel at the Jaguar VR headset that never shipped. In a way, the Jaguar has become what Atari could never make it, a system for enthusiasts by enthusiasts. Free from corporate deadlines and marketing spin, the Jaguar is finally delivering the creativity it once promised. Maybe that's the Jaguar's true destiny, not as a mainstream hit, but as a canvas for the passionate few who never stopped believing in the roar of Atari's last cat. Chapter 16, Outro, Lessons from the Jaguar.
The story of the Atari Jaguar is one of the most fascinating cautionary tales in gaming. On paper, it was a beast, a console boasting 64-bit architecture, custom RISC chips, CD-quality sound, and a marketing slogan daring you to do the math. For a brief moment, it looked like Atari might claw its way back into relevance. But the Jaguar was also a victim of hubris and timing. They bet everything on an ambitious but unwieldy design. They promised the moon, but delivered a handful of stars in a sky full of darkness. Developers were given poor tools, retailers had little faith, consumers felt misled. And so the Jaguar fell, not with the triumphant roar of a next-generation predator, but with a whimper, liquidated, merged into obscurity, remembered as a failure. Yet, here's the twist that makes the Jaguar more than just a punchline. It didn't truly die. By opening its platform, Hasbro accidentally gave the Jaguar a second life. Homebrew developers, collectors, and fans transformed it from a commercial tragedy into a cult legend. Decades later, it still inspires creativity, it still hosts new games, and it still sparks debates at conventions and online forums about what might have been. So, what can we learn from the Jaguar? Raw power isn't enough. Specs on paper mean nothing if developers can't use them. A console lives and dies by its tools, its games, and the support behind them. Marketing spin can't hide design flaws. Do the Math was catchy, but it also became a symbol of how hollow Atari's promises were. Numbers don't make great games, developers do. Passion outlives corporations. Atari, the company, is gone, but the Jaguar lives on because fans refuse to let it vanish. In the end, community mattered more than corporate strategy. The Jaguar's legacy is bittersweet. It was Atari's last stand in the console wars, a noble failure, a misunderstood experiment, and a strange little box that became a canvas for dreamers. When you hold a Jaguar controller today, with its oversized frame and awkward keypad, you're not just holding a piece of plastic. You're holding the weight of history, the story of a fallen empire, a desperate gamble, and the enduring power of players to keep forgotten machines alive. This has been Retro Rewind, and you've been listening to the full tale of the Atari Jaguar, a console that failed, but never truly disappeared.